Okay, I think perhaps we can begin. There may be more people joining us in the next few minutes, but we can perhaps start by making quick introductions. Hello and welcome to this semester's fourth EPRC webinar. My name is Martin Ferry. I'm a researcher here at EPRC. We're delighted to welcome you all today, and hopefully for future webinars, who knows, perhaps even face-to-face ones in Glasgow. Today we welcome Linda Stewart, who will be sharing her research on the topic, the changing role of universities in a sparsely populated region. The presentation will last about 25 to 30 minutes, and in the remaining time we'll open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. If you'd like to make an intervention, please use the Zoom hand function, or feel free to use the chat function as well. And after the presentation, we'll address these in questions and answers. Before introducing our speaker, please note that the meeting is being recorded. It means that you and colleagues will have the opportunity to follow it later. The recording will be made available on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. We'd also like to encourage you to use Twitter to share your thoughts and spread the word on the webinar. So let me present our speaker this morning. Linda is a graduate of Edinburgh University, and her career lecturing at Dumfries and Galloway and Inverness colleges first brought her into the realms of EU projects and funding programmes. But in 1998, she took on the new post of developing European engagement for the University of Highlands and Islands project. And in this post, Linda established a strong, distinctive European and international dimension to UHI, so working with regional partners on European structural funds, as well as other higher education institutions across Europe and beyond. Linda left her role as Director of European and International Engagement in December 2020 to focus on a PhD here with EPRC. In May 2021, she took up an internship with the Nordic and Arctic unit at Scottish Government, and subsequently joined the unit for another 4 months to carry out a specific project on Scotland's Nordic and Arctic engagement. So I think given this, Linda is very well placed to provide some insights on the role of universities in sparsely populated regions. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Linda to share her slides and her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin, for the kind introduction, and a thanks to EPRC for the opportunity to share my thoughts thus far with you. As Martin said, my research builds on the experience of working for 20 years through the establishment and development of the University of the Highlands and Islands in the north of Scotland, and being involved firsthand in the transformation that the institution has had on the region. I'm grateful to the EPRC team for the opportunity to step back at this stage and analyse just what that transformation means and how the experience fits with accepted theory and experience elsewhere. Thanks also to my friends and colleagues from the Highlands and Islands, UHI and Highlands and Islands Enterprise in particular, for their support and provision of data to inform my work to date. I'm at the point now, which I'm sure many of you will relate to, where I just keep uncovering more and more information and interesting avenues to explore. With that in mind, I'm sure many of you will appreciate that I've got more questions than answers at this point, but I hope these questions might be of some interest to you. In fact, I'd be most grateful to receive any suggestions or constructive criticism from you. I'm going to just touch briefly on these key questions in our session this morning. First of all, looking at what actually is a university. As many of you will know, the University of Bologna in Italy was founded in 1088 and is generally considered to be the oldest university in the Western world, as well as having the longest continuous operation as a university worldwide. The nomenclature university came from the Latin Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, a community of tutors and scholars. 934 years later, these communities still form an integral part of our world, at the heart of society, culture, and our economies. Why then did Europe's most established university, Bologna, make contact in 2012 with one of Europe's newest universities, the University of the Highlands and Islands, to discuss the role of the university in the region? What could they possibly have to learn from the brief experience of one of the new kids on the block in a peripheral rural corner of the then EU? Today, communities of tutors and scholars retain their place at the heart of our universities, but do or should these communities extend beyond the university campus, whether physical or virtual? How far should these communities vary in accordance with the geographical place of the institution? In particular, how do peripheral regions interact with higher education institutions, if indeed they even have one within their boundaries? Is there anything that our cherished and well-established institutions can in fact learn from the experiences of their younger counterparts in regional engagement? Although universities have always provided a dedicated space for the development of new ideas and concepts, their role in creating, fostering and delivering innovation as part of an integrated regional partnership has been acknowledged only relatively recently, and often in the face of strong opposition from those who believe universities should be more removed from everyday aspects of life. An interview with Joseph Westwood, Secretary of State for Scotland in 1943 in the Inverness Courier, gives an indication of the thinking of his time when asked about the question of an additional university in Scotland. He was unsure about the need for a fifth Scottish university, preferring to see an extension of existing universities to cater for additional students. But he did acknowledge that this might have to be considered longer term, due to the danger that, I quote, some universities might become unmanageable. The underlying assumption was that there was only one model of university, regardless of where it was located. But ultimately, he said, it was a decision for Cabinet. More recently, regional development and innovation, whether influencing the shape of an existing institution or calling for the establishment of a new one, has become increasingly relevant in the debate around the role of the university in Scotland and elsewhere. I've been investigating some of the drivers for this change. A relatively early argument that universities have a role beyond teaching and research was presented in the 1982 SERI report, The University in the Community, with heated debate following on. In 2013, Rodriguez Posey asked the question, do institutions matter for regional development? And in his introduction suggests that this question did not feature strongly in the 1990s, stating that the link between institutions and economic development had been fundamentally overlooked by mainstream economic theory in general and growth theory in particular. He goes on to recognise that circumstances of individual institutions form a critical role and that a one-size-fits-all approach does not work. He does this through the fascinating concept of the regional development bicycle, using the analogy of the two wheels of strategy and institutions, quote, to allow for sufficient wiggle room in order to maximise the potential for development of local institutional arrangements and adapt to changes in these arrangements. He also makes valid references to the difference between regional economic policies in richer and poorer regions. I wonder, is there a further, though not unrelated, distinction to be made between regions which have a well-established and connected university operating from within their boundaries and those who do not? Research by Michaela Triple et al. In 2015 identified 4 different types of university model, analysing the influence that policy institutions have on universities and how different national and regional contexts will shape university policy. Then, universities' roles in cross-border regional innovation strategies are investigated by Jos van der Broek, Francisca Eckhart and Paul Benneworth in 2017, extending consideration to the particular challenges presented in non-core and peripheral cross-border regions. These studies and many more offer an insight into the various ways in which universities have expanded from traditional roles, along with European Commission publications on regional information systems, smart specialisation strategies, lifelong learning, all looking at the need to develop greater research capacity and outputs, as well as a skilled workforce, if the EU is to compete in economic terms at global level. Such policies do feature in research or education programme grant allocations from the EU. However, the influence of cohesion policy in supporting universities in less developed regions and vice versa is often overlooked. Our colleague Sylwia Borkowska-Łazak is currently investigating how EU cohesion policy has been implemented in Poland and the wider political influence on EU funding allocations. An evaluation of the impact of the 2014 to 20 programmes may present a greater pool of evidence. So there's lots of raw material on the role of universities in regional economic development and the benefits to a region from strong collaboration with its university. But the puzzle I've been trying to grapple with over the past couple of years is, what about when a region doesn't have or hasn't had a university within its own boundaries? The development of the University of the Highlands and Islands throws up some useful pointers on this and demonstrates the continuing relevance of such questions. But first, a quick word on what we mean by sparsely populated. There's so much detail behind stark figures of population density like these, with other factors such as peripherality, rurality, geography, transport, all contributing towards the specifics of a region's place. It can be difficult to make informed comparisons, as units of measurement will differ, and comparing like with like does pose a challenge to us. For example, the Highlands and Islands of Scotland is one of the most beautiful regions in Europe, albeit I'm biased because I'm looking out my window at the lovely scenery of the Moray Firth. But it does have challenges, sparsity of population being one of them. I know, taking the train back home from Glasgow or Edinburgh, that population bases become more and more scattered as we head further north. However, the stark population density figure of 8.6 persons per square kilometre across the Highlands and Islands doesn't mean much until you compare it with elsewhere in Europe. Ah, you tell me, but what about the northern regions of Norway, Sweden and Finland, with a collective population density of only 4.9 inhabitants per square kilometre, or Iceland at only 3? You're right, the Highlands and Islands can't be compared with these, but sparsity becomes an issue when you compare it with the rest of Scotland, or UK, or Europe, as the figures on the slide demonstrate. And when so much of our public policy, including education and funding, is based on number counts, that becomes a problem. The map on your screen dates back to 2011. And whilst I haven't been able to source a more recent equivalent, it's still useful, I think, to demonstrate the relative scale of population sparsity, showing all the EU regions with a density of less than 12.5 persons per square kilometre, and you'll see a very stark picture. And all sorts of positive features can be overlaid onto the more densely populated areas, such as economic prosperity, access to public services, transport connectivity, and higher education provision access. I'm sure some of you at this point will remember the old blue banana maps. It's no coincidence that greater economic wealth tends to be in the areas of highest density of population. But what about the reverse? And it's when you combine sparsity of population with other geographical features, such as remoteness, peripherality, mountainous terrain, and dispersed island communities, that greater challenges can emerge. For example, the Highlands and Islands of Scotland covers more than half of Scotland's land mass. Up to the 1990s, it endured severe problems around the loss of young people seeking higher education opportunities elsewhere, with few returning. Existing businesses and industry had very limited access to continuing professional development, or research and development support, as there was no university based within its borders. It did, however, have a range of smaller tertiary education colleges and research institutions dotted across the region, as you can see in the map. In the 1990s, two game-changing opportunities were to present new solutions. Firstly, the advent of online connectivity begged the question of how these existing institutions could be linked up to create a new kind of higher education model, a model created through partnership with regional stakeholders and moulded around the economic and social needs of the whole region, including the most remote and scattered island communities, rather than a centrally located traditional model in the only larger population base of Inverness. In today's world of global online communications and connections, it's easy to forget that only 30 years ago, this kind of approach was deemed revolutionary for tertiary education, met with disbelief, if not scorn, by many academics. Secondly, the region qualified for EU Objective 1 status for the 1994 to 99 structural funds programmes, due to GDP being less than 75% of the EU average. Coupled with a substantial grant from the Millennium Commission, some £33.35 million, which could be used to co-finance EU funds, this offered a significant and breakthrough funding source for ambitious plans to create a regional university. Today, the region is home to the 11-year-old University of the Highlands and Islands, one of Europe's most innovative models of further and higher education. It's a distinctive partnership of 12 independent colleges and research institutions from across the region. And incidentally, if any of you remember previous presentations quoting 13 partner institutions, just recently the two institutions up in Shetland, North Atlantic Fisheries College and Shetland College, have merged. So we're down to 12 partners. They're all locally based and rooted in their communities, but with a national and international reach as part of a regional university structure, with an innovative approach to learning and distinctive research and curriculum, which reflect the nature of the region and its communities. The concept of a university based in the Highlands and Islands was enabled to a significant extent through EU cohesion policy, which levered in about £200 million towards the infrastructure of the new institution over the period 1994 to 2020, on the basis of the breakthrough that having its own university would have on the Highlands and Islands. Had the policy not placed such a strong emphasis on territorial cohesion, focusing on the inherent inequality of lack of access to higher education within the region, the story might have been very different. Over 4 structural funds programming periods from 1994, this investment has funded estates, research capacity, including staff and facilities, additional student numbers, wider access, curriculum development, and, critically, much of the underlying IT connectivity. Without this investment, it's unlikely that the fledgling university would have flourished as quickly as it did, nor certainly to the same scale. However, for ERDF and ESF funding to be directed towards UHI, a strong case for the additionality of this investment in terms of impact on GDP was demanded and was constantly scrutinised by the European Commission representatives. Without the support and cooperation of key regional players, particularly Highlands and Islands Enterprise, the region's development agency, and the 7 local authorities across the region, as well as third sector bodies, the awarding of funds and, more importantly, the delivery of appropriate development activities simply would not have been possible. Unlike other regional initiatives over this time, which often saw universities having to be enticed into the murky realms of regional development, or indeed a reluctance in some cases on the part of other regional players to bring in the academic community over fears that they would dominate the planning process, the Highlands and Islands instead can evidence true partnership and joint planning and delivery. UHI participation in programme development process right from the very start was so important ensuring that targets and eligibility criteria were in line with the needs of the new institution and its distinctive delivery model, always based on potential impact on regional economic growth and sustainability. Today, UHI's research capacity, course provision and student numbers do continue to rise. A 2020 report by Bigger Economics reported that in 2019, the university and its academic partners had a combined income of £135 million, employed almost 3,100 members of staff, and had a student population of over 38,600 people on all further and higher education courses. As a large and dispersed organisation, it has a significant economic footprint in the region. In 2019, the university generated £560 million GVA and supported 6,200 jobs throughout the economy in the Highlands and Islands, Moray and Perthshire. Now, these are not perhaps hugely significant sums in comparison with other Scottish and UK higher education institutions, but in the context of a new institution based in a peripheral, sparsely populated region, I think it's pretty impressive. Also wondered, how does the UHI experience compare with others in remote, sparsely populated regions? Although UHI was very much rooted in its place, from inception it looked beyond its own borders for inspiration and lessons to be learned and shared. Several early partnerships were formed with institutions in similar circumstances to UHI in more rural, remote and sparsely populated areas, particularly in Nordic and Arctic regions, based on the increasing awareness of the potential of new technology to overcome the tyranny of geography and the barriers preventing access to higher education in more peripheral areas. One notable example from that time was the Academy Norr initiative in the north of Sweden. Now, this was an association of 13 municipalities who worked together to facilitate access to existing university courses from elsewhere in Sweden. One of the driving factors behind both UHI and Academy Norr plans in the early days was to address the historic loss of young people from the region to access higher education further south, with few returning. Several strategic Northern Periphery projects funded joint research into the issues, as well as then collaborative course development and delivery on the ground for learning centre staff. What's interesting about this collaboration is that although both UHI and Academy Norr were addressing the same challenges and learned a huge amount from each other through the process of collaboration, each ended up with substantially different models. Academy Norr today is run by a group of local authorities, using their local facilities and resources to facilitate higher education delivery from existing providers elsewhere. UHI went down the road of developing a new distributed model of higher education institution based inside the region itself. UHI was also a founding member of the University of the Arctic, UArctic, in 2001, and was the only non-Arctic founding member. And you'll maybe be able to make out some of the interesting and very impressive stats around UArctic on the slide there. But most importantly, I think it's worth looking at where the partner institutions are. And by and large, they are actually in the more sparsely populated rural parts of our world. Today, UArctic is a highly respected global research network with more than 200 members, but the interest in UHI's unique model remains. Engagement in UArctic has offered UHI many opportunities for collaboration, including with the interesting initiative in the north of Norway, for example, the Arctic University of Norway, UiT, which is a merger of 5 existing higher education institutions across the region, offering a wide range of provision as the 3rd largest university in Norway and the most northernmost university in the world. Today, there are 7 Scottish universities which are members of UArctic, and they've formed a useful operational network with UHI playing a key role. A good example of university regional collaboration functioning at Scottish level. In conclusion, there has clearly been a shift in the role and function of universities, particularly over the last 30 years, with increasing globalization and online connectivity opening up new possibilities for organizations and regions out with high population densities and peripheral to main economic centres. UHI's experience, facilitated by the investment of EU structural funds through cohesion policy and brought about through regional partnership, was undoubtedly a game changer for the Highlands and Islands, both economically and socially. Of course, the funds were critical, but the benefits of working in strong partnership across the UHI academic partners, partnership with other regional stakeholders, and partnership with other key players, such as Scottish Government and the European Commission, in line with the policy of territorial cohesion, should not be underestimated. These partnerships led to a strong shared sense of achievement in the creation of a new higher education model designed specifically for the region and helped to build up the profile of the fledgling organisation, enabling it to form links with universities and networks worldwide, learning from these and contributing towards them. Of course, challenges remain, but UHI's existence has helped the region to become measurably stronger in many areas beyond access to higher education, such as employment, unemployment rates, population changes, and also interesting feedback from positive feedback from wellbeing surveys among its young people. But perhaps the most outstanding contribution that UHI has made at the present time is in increasing regional resilience in the face of significant challenges ahead. The UK's decision to exit the EU in 2014 caused shockwaves across the UK and in every sector. Higher education institutions immediately began to assess implications, identifying potential loss of access to research partnerships and student-staff mobility as key areas. UHI shared these concerns and joined lobbying efforts to mitigate them with the rest of the sector. However, unlike any other UK higher education institutions, the greatest potential risk from Brexit for UHI was the withdrawal from EU cohesion policy and loss of structural funds. The Highlands and Islands European Partnership, HIEP, which comprises UHI, Highlands and Islands Enterprise and the 7 local authorities across the region, worked together to quantify the extent of these risks and lobby for a future UK regional policy which would recognise the challenges of peripherality and sparsity of population to the same degree as EU cohesion policy had done. UHI engaged in a dual approach, working with both the higher education sector and the Highlands and Islands European Partnership to plan for a very different future. While there have been some encouraging signs regarding access to the new EU research programme Horizon Europe for UK higher education institutions and an alternative domestic scheme for student mobility, the Turing scheme, has been introduced, there is certainly doubt about how these will operate in practice or how effective they might be. The UK government replacement for the structural funds, the Shared Prosperity Fund, has to date provided no encouragement for the Highlands and Islands, and access to European territorial cooperation programmes is unlikely, with a notable exception of the Peace Plus programme. Then, when the coronavirus pandemic hit the world in 2020, all aspects of life were affected. Higher education had to consider first and foremost the health and well-being of students and staff, but then the challenges of continuing some provision in a situation whereby lockdowns and travel restrictions meant that no face-to-face provision was possible. For most institutions, this meant an urgent review of online provision and delivery. Now, the overall impact on UHI was just as far-reaching. However, when it came to online provision, it was able to quickly extend protocols and blended learning means of delivery, which were already in place and familiar to most students and staff, rather than having to develop these from practically scratch. Brexit and COVID-19 are, of course, separate issues, but together they bring significant risks for all universities and regions and raise some fundamental questions about the future role of higher education and research in a wider societal context. The persistent fragilities of the Highlands and Islands are brought into focus on a recent study by Highlands and Islands Enterprise, which states that in the Scottish context, 5 of the 6 local authority areas most vulnerable to Brexit are in the Highlands and Islands, due to sectors more dependent on migrant workers, EU grants, and with a more fragile population. However, 30 years after the early proposals for a new university model, and 11 years since the award of university title, UHI stands alongside other Highlands and Islands stakeholders, better equipped together to build resilience and plan for the future post-Brexit and COVID-19. Unlike in previous times of crisis, when the region would typically fare even worse than any other region. And while the UHI model doesn't exactly fit any of the documented models for higher education I've researched thus far, it is an exact fit for its own unique place. So, to return in closing to Rodriguez Pose's question, do institutions matter for regional development? The case of the development of UHI in that peripheral corner of Scotland would suggest that they certainly do. UHI's experience suggests that there's significant added value to a region, and maybe even more so in a peripheral context, in having its own university inside its own boundaries, and that today's challenges of Brexit and COVID-19 reinforce that concept. So to return virtually to Bologna, it's not, therefore, that the new role of a university as part of its region is a threat to Universitas Magistrorum et Scholarium, but rather that it enhances it, giving it greater relevance and acknowledging the importance of research and academic input in growing a region's economy and society, even if that region is remote and with low population levels. And perhaps the experiences of creating this new university model as an integral part of the region through shared aspirations with other regional stakeholders does, after all, hold useful lessons for others, even the 934-year-old University of Bologna. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Linda. Yeah, if you want to stop sharing. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. I'd like to open up now. We still have time left for any questions or points that the participants would like to raise. Please feel free to raise a hand or come into the chat function to make a point. I'm having a look. No one's so far. Oh, David, yes, please, if you'd like to come in, David Charles, just unmute. Thank you.
Hi. Hi everyone. Thanks, Linda. That was really great. Really enjoyed that. It's a really nice presentation. And just wanted to really comment and sort of add to some of the points you made towards the end there. I've done a bit of work on universities in sort of rural and sparse areas, including the Highlands and Islands. And I think one of the things that the Highlands and Islands has really been very lucky with is having its own university and having the control of that university within the region. Because in many other rural areas, what they get is a branch campus. And as such, those campuses tend to be very limited in what they can offer, and what they're allowed to offer by the parent university, perhaps in a city nearby. And one of the problems with small campuses in rural areas typically is, they have to be specialist because they're small. And that limits what they can offer. And there's what I've found is often there's a sort of feeling amongst local partners that they don't get as much from the university as they might expect. And I think that's particularly true small branch campuses. You know, no doubt it's still a little bit of a problem in Highlands and Islands because it's not the biggest university and the resources are distributed, so you don't get that kind of critical mass that you might get in having a big campus university. But I think having that local control is really important to ensure that those resources are directed towards addressing local needs and ensuring the resilience of the campuses. There are, other cases of rural campuses which have been under threat of closure, and indeed some which have closed because the parent university has been unwilling to continue to support them. So I think having your own university in the Highlands and Islands is really important in that respect. And then just to sort of add, most recently, I've been working on a paper with a colleague at the Arctic University up in Tromsø, and looking at how universities in rural areas impact on their regions, and looking beyond the sort of industry links as well. So we're very much looking there at how in things like arts and culture, universities can engage with local communities of practice and become part of them. And by working through those communities of practice, building local resources, which then can attract other activities such as tourism. And so we have this sort of model that we use, which was initially developed in largely by Paul Bennyworth, when we were both sort of working with him on a proposal for a project based on this at the time he died, unfortunately. But we wanted to sort of get this model and this work that we've been developing out there. So that's a paper is sort of at a revise and resubmit level at the moment, but I don't mind sharing that with you if that would be helpful, along with maybe one or two other things I've got on rural universities. So so happy to talk and help at any time if you want, but I'll perhaps send through that most recent paper that's under development at the moment.
Thanks very much for that, and certainly, David, it would be good to have a longer chat with you about that. And I appreciate a look at that paper. You raised quite a number of points there that just chime so much, particularly with the early days of UHI, and it was actually a massive challenge in those early days because there was such a pent-up demand for university type provision, and just the whole aspect and kudos, if you like, of having a university in the region. But you're right, it was a small institution, particularly in the early days, and the whole issue of critical mass was fundamental. In a sense, that's what drove a lot of the initial thinking about the model. If you go back to the 1960s, when there was an expansion of universities across the UK, there was a bit of an argument between the towns of Inverness and Stirling as to who would receive the next university. And there was massive disappointment in Inverness when we were not successful on that. But the fact is, it is unlikely that if that had been successful, we would have had sufficient critical mass in Inverness to develop a really groundbreaking institution. With hindsight, it was probably a good thing because it meant that the issues, that the need for a university was still there when we came to the 1990s, and we could start looking at how you could develop a new model of higher education, linking up all the existing institutions. Would that have happened in the 1960s? Absolutely not. Would it have happened indeed without a massive injection of funding through funding and policy drives through cohesion policy? I don't think that would have happened either. But even now, I think there does need to be a careful consideration of where the boundaries lie. There is, you will find from time to time disappointment that we don't have, for example, a law degree or a medicine degree at the moment in UHI. We've had to be very pragmatic about saying, well, wait a minute, is there a need for further degrees of that nature in Scotland? And the decision thus far has been to concentrate on where the real areas of need and where the university is able to develop substantial areas of expertise rather than, if you like, spread the jam too thin. So lots of interesting points raised there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Does anyone else want to come in at this point with questions or comments? If not, I can perhaps come in. I have a question I'd like to ask Linda. I'm particularly interested in the influence of cohesion policy on this, on the evolution of UHI. And you mentioned, if you think in terms firstly of the benefits that are offered, you mentioned obviously the injection of funding is clearly important. But at the top of your list of, if you like, factors, cohesion policy related factors, you had partnership. This is something that we hear so much about, the partnership principle of cohesion policy. But it's often quite abstract or generic. So I'm just wondering in practice, what cohesion policy brought to the table in terms of partnership, because I'm thinking in a setting like the Highlands and Islands, this sort of idea of building capacity for networks and linkages amongst regional stakeholders with communities and so on could be particularly important. Did that work, or has that worked out in practice, where a partnership approach as espoused by cohesion policy had an impact on how UHI has evolved in practice?
Very, very much so, Martin. In fact, to the extent that I think if there wasn't a strong and actually delivering partnership as opposed to an abstract one that you write down on an application for funding, I don't think UHI would have developed, indeed would have come into existence. The partnership on the ground was hugely important at the very early days. In fact, if it wasn't for key drivers from Highland Council and Highlands and Islands Enterprise in particular, I don't think the model would have been developed, and it certainly wouldn't have been as successful. The early partnerships through, I mentioned the Highlands and Islands European Partnership with UHI High and the 7 local authorities, weren't just, again, a sort of useful gathering. It operated very, very strongly on the ground. It was a joint force for lobbying, particularly at the start of new cohesion programs, to look at what the region needed and to organise best and to lobby for the best outcomes for that region. It was a strong partnership because we were all pointing in the same direction, and whether that needed to be at Scottish level, UK level or EU level, we were there as a group, as a strong group, and prepared to take our case and present it wherever necessary. Now, once the funding came through, of course, there was competition. That's what the whole process is based on. But I think getting to that starting point was so important, and the ability to look at long-term planning with the other key regional stakeholders was important. There's also the aspect of partnership at more local level, because of course, as I said, the Highlands and Islands is a huge geographical area. It's larger than Belgium. If you recall the map that I had with the different UHI academic partners, these are dotted right across the whole region there. And of course, there's a strong link at local level with the area's local authority. I mentioned the previously 2, now 1 partner up in Shetland, and the provision up there, whether it's fisheries research or looking at the amazing textiles design degree at Shetland College, there's a strong link with Shetland Islands Council, and it's a separate partnership, but them coming together where appropriate, I think has definitely made such a difference to how the organisation has developed and any success that's been there so far.
Okay, thanks, Linda. And a quick follow-up question, perhaps looking at the more challenging side, is thinking about universities not being typical beneficiaries of cohesion policy. If we think about how EU funds support universities, we think of the Horizon projects, Horizon Europe, the framework projects, and so on, which kind of fits with typical university activities. Dealing with ERDF and ESF projects is a different matter, and I'm just wondering, in terms of the capacities or the fit that you may have or you may have experienced there, challenges in that respect, and another challenge perhaps being how the cohesion policy agenda fitted with the evolution of Scottish higher education policy. If these 2 agendas evolved together, were closely coordinated, or whether tensions there as well. Yeah, thanks. And I noticed that Seraphine and Liliana are coming with questions. Maybe if Linda, if you answer this, then we can have 2 further questions.
Certainly. So some quick points on that. You're right to highlight that this was an issue, and particularly in the very early days of UHI, it was a huge struggle to make the case as to why cohesion policy and structural funds should support the development of a university. The Commission's main response to that was, well, look, we've got these research programs, we've got these wonderful education programs. Why are you asking us for some of our money? And again, it was back to the partnership issue. It was the partners, not just the higher education sector in the region, that was saying, wait a minute, we're not going to be able to make the breakthrough that's needed in our economy or see any sustainable growth unless we have a university there. We're not going to get a university. Looking at the massive cost of not just building a building in Inverness, for example, but building facilities, learning centres in the more remote parts of the region, and very expensive in the early days, fitting the pipes, if you like, for IT connectivity, and looking at all the issues around that. That was a massive investment from the EU, but it took a heck of a lot of persuasion and determination and constant monitoring of the impact that was having. Looking at changing cohesion policy and Scottish higher education, that's been a bit of a challenge as well. And again, particularly in recent days when the sector got together to look at the impact of Brexit. Initially, it was actually quite a challenge to argue that, oh, wait a minute, it's not just Horizon, it's not just some of the Erasmus mobility exchange programs we need to be looking at. We need to include cohesion policy. We stuck with that, and I'm pleased to say that there was recognition of the fact that this needs to be part of the equation. One of the downsides we were concerned about in the most recent, and indeed sadly our last programming period of 2014 to 20, was that there was very much a centralisation of the policy across Scotland. And although on the one hand it was good to see that the role of universities was arguably slightly more acknowledged there, the assumption was it was traditional higher education provision in more urban areas rather than the sort of more sort of off the wall, if you like, provision that we supported in UHI. So maybe a mixed bag, maybe dare I say it, a victim of our own success at that point.
Thanks, Linda. I noticed Seraphine, if you want to come in now with the question. Thank you.
Thank you. I say hello, Linda, and congratulations for this work. We know from many years back, as I work for COSLA on these issues, but today perhaps with my more academic hat on. What in places where I'm from, for instance, in Spain, is known as the Highlands model, which some of yourselves have been actually having exchanges with Spain in Spanish, similar bodies in the past, I'm aware. It's based essentially on partnerships, a very strong partnership between the different actors. This is the most viable part of the model. From a comparative perspective, I would say it's very, very strong. But I also would like to perhaps some reflection in terms of the partnership with the governments. Because I mean, the whole Highlands and Islands institutional setting, the enterprise agency, the universities, it came at the time there was the Scotland office, and there was like a rather kind of cross-party consensus in the MPs of the area to try to row together in Westminster, and that's actually helped things to move along in terms of creating the various Highlands and Islands institutions, including that. Then became the evolution, with the Scottish government that is closer, but at the same time a government that wants to have been more hands-on, and now we got the UK government again wanted to come back to the different parts of the UK on the terrain. So I mean, it's just a reflection on how the partners have managed over the year, because you have that experience, over the years to different multi-level relationships, so to speak, and your prospects for the future. I mean, your best guess about how this multi-level relationship that is so important for the Highlands and Islands, the partners in the area for their success. That multi-level aspect is so important as well. So, thank you.
Hello, Seraphine. How lovely to see you again. And can I just say thanks for all of your support over the years. It was good to have a friend at court on COSLA so much of the time. Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it has been really good to see that our model has been recognised on a much wider scale, and particularly by some of our friends in Spain. Indeed, the whole UArctic model owes a lot to the same thinking as we had with UHI in the early days, and I think that's why we've been so pleased to be treated technically. Highlands and Islands is not within the Arctic Circle, but we're given special status and often referred to as near Arctic, which we'll have to settle for. And I must admit that the cold wind yesterday, it felt like it was getting nearer and nearer. Yeah, that's an interesting reflection on how the partnerships have changed with government over the years. In the very early days before devolution, it was exceptionally difficult to get our vision across. Partly, to be fair, because the civil servants and indeed a lot of the politicians that we were dealing with had come through traditional university education. And again, bear in mind the massive changes since the late 1990s. This upstart institution, which was only a project, coming forward and saying that, well, we're going to have a university, but it's not going to be in one place. And we're not all going to be together in the same room. And we're not going to have massive big lecture theatres with one person standing at the front. It was met with incredulity, to be quite honest, on many occasions. And there were several points in the journey looking back where it very nearly did go under. However, again, to get back to our theme of partnerships, those who were involved were so committed to this idea and so convinced that we have to make it work somehow, that they stuck with it. And it was that determination that I think saw through all the pitfalls, and there were many of them in those early days. It was, of course, quite a change when we moved to working from working with the Scottish office to the Scottish Executive and then Scottish Government. But I think, again, the determination just always came through. I'm looking at some of the perhaps less measurable benefits of UHI to the region. One is a sense of pride, a sense of achievement, and perhaps more confidence in the region's ability to perform. After all, it's got its own university. And I think that has helped us through a lot of the time. My fear, to come to your final question, is when we look at the prospects for the future, that yes, the investment, as I say, but also the ability to work together, or the encouragement and the rationale for working together in that kind of partnership is not at this point apparent to me in the planned delivery for the Shared Prosperity Fund. I hope that my region will continue to argue for something that is a bit more, and I think there's some encouraging, I mean, you know, we have some useful partnership bodies beyond just the Highlands and Islands European Partnership, which you're well familiar with, looking at the Convention of the Highlands and Islands and new plans, I believe, for regional economic partnerships. But frankly, I think the path ahead is going to be very difficult.
Great. Thank you, Linda, for that. I see we're now coming up to the hour mark. So unless anyone else has a quick question they'd like to include, then I can conclude by thanking Linda for an excellent presentation, and thank you to our participants for the discussion, the interesting discussion that we had afterwards. Just for housekeeping, our next webinar will be on April the 6th, where we'll look at cycling mobility, how it can benefit tourist cities. That will be presented by Wilbert Den Hood. You can always contact us for a mailing list to be kept up to date with future events. And having said that, I'd like